Wir haben eine Auftaktveranstaltung gemacht Ende Januar in Berlin mit Helmut Schmidt und werden nun im Laufe des Jahres in Norddeutschland, in Westdeutschland, in Süddeutschland gemeinsam mit diesen anderen beiden Stiftungen öffentliche Veranstaltungen durchführen. Und wir wollen zu einem differenzierten China-Bild in Deutschland beitragen. Die heutige Diskussion beschäftigt sich mit Chinas wirtschaftlicher Bedeutung in der Welt und den damit verbundenen Chancen und Risiken für China, aber auch für uns hier in Deutschland und Europa. Wenn Sie die letzten Jahre verfolgt haben, in Zeitungen, in den Medien, jagt ja ein Superlativ den anderen beim Thema China. China hat Japan überholt, ist jetzt die zweitgrößte Volkswirtschaft der Welt. Auf absehbare Zeit wird China die größte Volkswirtschaft der Welt sein. China sitzt heute auf den größten Devisenreserven der Welt. Und es hat Deutschland überholt als Exportweltmeister. Diese Zeiten sind für Deutschland sicherlich vorbei. Dieses immense Wirtschaftswachstum, was China in den vergangenen Jahren vorgelegt hat, hat dazu geführt, dass in China Millionen von Chinesen aus der Armut befreit worden sind. Aber es gibt eben auch Schattenseiten, hohe Kosten dieses immensen Wirtschaftswachstums. Denken wir zum Beispiel an ein zunehmendes Stadt-Land-Gefälle, zunehmende soziale Ungleichheit, Korruption, Inflationsrisiken, um nur einige zu nennen, und ganz besonders natürlich auch das Thema Umweltschutz. Also die Frage ist, kann das Wachstum in diesen Wachstumsraten von 9% oder 8% auf Dauer weitergehen oder gibt es Grenzen, die auch in China irgendwann wirksam werden? Gerade letzte Woche hat der chinesische Premierminister auf dem Nationalen Volkskongress die Wachstumsprojektion für das nächste Jahr auf nur noch 7,5% verringert. Von solchen Zahlen können wir in Deutschland nur träumen. Es gibt auch viele in China und andere Experten, die dem etwas Positives abgewinnen, weil sie sagen, dann ist die Gefahr geringer, dass die chinesische Wirtschaft überhitzt. Aber es gibt auch viele, die sagen, das ist gefährlich, wenn die Wachstumsraten zu stark sinken, werden soziale Unruhen in China weiter zunehmen und es wird für die Kommunistische Partei zunehmend schwieriger, dieses Wachstums- und Wohlstandsversprechen an die chinesische Bevölkerung weiterhin einzulösen. Und die Frage ist das jetzt dann gut oder ist das nun schlecht für Deutschland? Darüber wollen wir heute diskutieren. Welche Faktoren beeinflussen Chinas zukünftige Entwicklung? Welche Herausforderungen wird sich China stellen müssen? Und was bedeutet das alles für uns hier in Deutschland und Europa? Ich freue mich, dass wir heute Abend zwei exzellente Experten begrüßen können, die diese Fragen sowohl aus chinesischer Sicht als auch aus deutscher Sicht beleuchten können. Zunächst heiße ich ganz herzlich willkommen Herrn Wang Shuo. Herr Wang begann seine Karriere als Journalist und Redakteur 1995 bei der staatseigenen Zeitung People's Daily. 1998 gründete er mit Hu Shuli, einer der bekanntesten Wirtschaftsjournalistinnen in China, das Magazin Caijing und war dort 10 Jahre lang Redakteur und Manager. Das redaktionelle Team unter seiner Leitung hat mehrere Journalistenpreise gewonnen und Herr Wang wurde selbst bereits zweimal als Young Leader auf dem Boao Forum Asien nominiert. Zusammen mit Hu Shuli gründete er 2009, also vor 3 Jahren, das Wirtschaftsmagazin Caijin Media, wo er heute als leitender Redakteur für die Print- und für die Online-Ausgabe zuständig ist. Vor kurzem wurde Herr Wang außerdem als Young Global Leader 2012 auf dem Weltwirtschaftsforum geehrt. Heißen Sie mit mir ganz herzlich willkommen, Herrn Wang. Ein ganz herzliches Willkommen geht auch an Herrn Jörg Wuttke. Herr Wuttke lebt und arbeitet seit über 20 Jahren in China und ich glaube, man kann ihn mit Fug und Recht als Old China Hand bezeichnen, wie man das im Englischen so sagt. Herr Wuttke studierte in Mannheim Betriebswirtschaft und Wirtschaftswissenschaften und in Shanghai und in Taipei Chinesisch. 1988 ging er für die Firma ABB das erste Mal für 2 Jahre nach China, kehrte 1995 als Generalbevollmächtigter für ABB zurück. 2 Jahre später wechselte er zu BASF China und ist dort heute Geschäftsführer und Generalbevollmächtigter. Er war 1999 außerdem eines der Gründungsmitglieder der Deutschen Handelskammer in China, war dort von 2004 bis 2011 Aufsichtsratsvorsitzender und von 2007 bis 2010 zusätzlich Präsident der Europäischen Handelskammer in China. 2008 veröffentlichte er ein Buch, My 30 Years in China. Herzlich willkommen, Herr Wuttke. Last but not least darf ich ganz herzlich begrüßen unsere Moderatorin heute Abend, Frau Sabine Stricker-Kellerer. Frau Stricker-Kellerer ist Senior China Counsel bei der Kanzlei Freshfields Bruckhaus Deringer und berät europäische Unternehmen bei ihren Geschäftsaktivitäten in China. 1985 hat sie die erste Präsenz einer kontinentaleuropäischen Kanzlei in China gegründet. Sie hat über 25 Jahre Erfahrung in der Beratung bei Gründung, Strukturierung und Umstrukturierung von Auslandsinvestitionen in China. Sie ist außerdem Mitglied des Außenwirtschaftsbeirates, des Bundeswirtschaftsministers und des Deutsch-Chinesischen Dialogforums. Liebe Frau Stricker-Kellerer, wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie heute Abend uns durch den Abend, durch die Diskussion leiten werden. Ein herzliches Willkommen. Ich darf Ihnen nun allen einen aufschlussreichen, interessanten und spannenden Abend wünschen. Der kurze Hinweis, die Diskussion wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Wenn Sie also des Englischen nicht so mächtig sind, dann sollten Sie die Kopfhörer nutzen, die Ihnen, glaube ich, am Eingang hoffentlich ausgehändigt worden sind. Damit darf ich unsere drei Panelisten auf die Bühne bitten. Dankeschön.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paulsen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Growth without limits is our topic, with a question mark, of course. I'm really honored that I have these two distinguished panelists who will create the evening with their enthusiasm, which I have known for a while. We will spend the first few minutes looking back before we look about the coming growth. We look back to the past growth first. We look back and try to put it in a nutshell by a journalist and a veteran industrialist, in a nutshell, what were the growth factors for China's economic miracle. And then we look forward what the challenges are. Mr. Wang.
Thank you. There might be 1,000 reasons for China's economic rise, but to me, two among them are most important to me. I think the first is a rural reform in 1980s, which liberated farmers from the farmland and turned them into industrial workers. And the second is China's WTO accession in 2001, which integrated Chinese economy into the world economic system. I remembered that right after 2001, the major newspapers around the world started to talk about that China became the world's factory. And then 1 year later, they started to talk about that China was exporting deflation to the whole world because we are using such a large pool of cheap labor force. And then 2003, renminbi, RMB's exchange rate became a serious international issue for the first time. And then another year passed, according to these same newspapers, that China's rise became unstoppable. I think, looking back, rural reform in the 1980s and China's WTO accession in 2001, both are not unique recipe from China. They are part of the normalization process of the economy away from total state control toward market economy. These are basically internal liberalization of the economy and also the globalization. These are the true driving forces for China's economic rise. As far as as far as this normalization process continues, I have every confidence into China's economic future.
Thank you. Jörg Wuttke, Mr. Wang links immediately China's growth to an international aspect, to globalization, to WTO accession, which is quite surprising because we would normally think China's growth criteria would come from a more domestically driven decisions. What is the perception from the West? What could be the key criteria for the growth?
First of all, I'm very happy to be back because what my bio omits in the beginning is actually I grew up in Hamburg as a kid. So it's funny to be back to try to explain China. Well, let me go even one step more back than Mr. Wang did, because I think the real kickstart of the Chinese economic growth model was Deng Xiaoping's decision to give every farmer a plot of land. This plot of land gave them basically the stability and the income in order to go into private market, which is a very significant development because this really distinguishes China from India, where you don't have any land reform. So the kickstart number one was basically giving people land property in order to build their business on. I think the second step is and the growth dimension is actually the Chinese entrepreneurial DNA. I mean, people who have been living in Asia have seen the success of Singapore, of Taiwan, of Hong Kong, of the overseas Chinese. There is just an entrepreneur, an Unternehmer as we call it, in each and every Chinese. Now the trick of Deng Xiaoping was to unleash this, to let this happen, because what we have seen before under the same Communist Party is that this entrepreneurial spirit was basically suppressed. So here we go. Deng Xiaoping in '92 says, getting rich is glorious, and China never looked back, and ever since then, basically 20 years, we had 10% growth every year on average. So what makes now this country, beside these two criteria of having property, and the second is just having this kind of culture that helps entrepreneurialism, is also the fact that China is urbanizing, meaning people go from the countryside to the cities. And to give you a dimension of what's happening there is 1% of population every year. In short, China builds New York once a year. And you can imagine what kind of construction, what kind of things happens there. And secondly, this other dimension is just China is growing fast because it has very few children, very few old people, meaning consumption is high, meaning relatively high, as well as that you have little money to put aside for children education and for old age, which is going to turn against China in 10 or 20 years from now. So at this stage, I would agree with Mr. Wang that the growth dynamics for the next 10 years, based on urbanization, based on this entrepreneurial DNA, and based on this kind of demographic sweet spot, meaning few young, few old, is actually the one that really drives this nation to this kind of incredible growth that we have seen and possibly can imagine to a lower extent in the next years.
Okay, so we have like a milestone every 10 years. We talk about agriculture, rural reform in the 80s. We have Deng Xiaoping's trip to the south in the early 90s, WTO accession in the 10 years ago. So now moving forward, China changed like the world changed. Nothing is the way it was before. What are the key challenges? What will keep driving us to growth?
First, according to most recent Bloomberg statistics, that among the top 10 global banks, 4 banks are from China. Among the top 10 Fortune 500 companies, 3 are from China. And the last time this thing happened to an Asian country is 1980s, Japan, right? And so China is no Japan because our Chinese population is relatively young. And also, I agree with Jörg that maybe for the first time in Chinese history, the entire population is working so hard, extremely hard, to get rich as soon as possible. So if only we don't screw up, the Chinese economy will take care of itself from the perspective of growth. But to not screw up is not an easy job, actually. There are many challenges. I want to name just 3 of them. I think the first is that we need a nationwide, unified, and portable social security system. Today, the social security system, including medical insurance system and the pension system, are fragmented and inadequate and are managed by local governments, which means they are not portable. Hundreds of millions of migrant workers are coming out of a countryside to work in the cities. Few of them enjoy any social benefits. For the lucky few who really does, they are not portable. So this current social security system is discriminating strongly against social mobility. It's unfair, unsustainable, and in the long run could be very destructive. It should be replaced by a unified, portable, nationwide social security system as soon as possible. Secondly, my second point is that we need another round of land reform. As Jock has pointed out, the first land reform in 1980s enabled the farmers to have partial ownership right to the lands. The keyword is partial. The Chinese don't never give clear legal protection to farmers over their land rights. The ambiguity in label, and also the current law stipulated that any farmland, if converted to non-farming use, must be nationalized first, usually by local government at very low prices. And in many cases, farmers are forced from their own land. This has become the #1 sources of social unrest in China. Currently, the central government is trying to keep the status quo, but I think their effort is futile. Across the country, at provincial level, at the city level, local governments are trying to work out different arrangements with the farmers. It's an ongoing, grand, big social experiment with profound consequences for China's future. I don't think anybody has a specific answer to it, but we will see in the coming years very quickly with very profound consequences. And third, we need to get rid of the last price control by the state. The states still control the price of key resources, including the energy prices and the prices of capital. It sends distorted signal through the economy. It enables bad.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. You might be a bit surprised about Mr. Wang's answer. The answers he gives us to the question on the future of economic growth, 2 out of 3 rest in the social area. Social security system, labor reform. So it's not primarily, the economic players he's touching upon. Of course, the third one was price reform, which is sort of what the state does, right? And we come back to that, to the other players later in the evening. But that is very interesting, and we come back to what the economic factors are. What do you want to add, Jörg?
Well, put China into perspective for a moment, why it really matters to us. I mean, China is, as you all know, 1.3, 1.4 billion people. It's actually not a country, it's a continent. If Germany would be a province of China, then it would be province number 4, as 3 provinces have more people than the Federal Republic of Germany. So the dimension of challenges that nation, that continent is facing is unprecedented. Because I would argue that over the last 10 years, China had an incredible run of 10 years of 10% growth. And as many of us say, they have possibly plucked the low-hanging fruits. It was easy to achieve that because of cheap labor, cheap capital, this hard-working style that Mr. Wang was alluding to. So what's next? You're facing now 10 years, and we think in 10 years, because the new administration coming into office in October will be facing 10 years under their rule, is going to face aging China. You can't run an economy at 10%. It's impossible. Wen Jiabao, the prime minister, just put China at 7.5%, because if you go on like 10%, at this stage already, China produces 50% of the cement of the world. And they need 8 to 9 million barrels a day of oil. If China would grow on like this, we would have no oil and you would have no cars to drive unless you have an electric vehicle. So the transition from this kind of growth that China had over the last years to the next 10 years is going to what defines the economy of the next years and what's going to define your price structure here in Hamburg, as well as what kind of products we can still produce, because we're not going to have more oil or more of many of these commodities. So the growth driver for China is they have to leave this growth model and move to another one. They have to stop building too many roads, too many cities, too many harbors, too many airports that are hardly utilized, and actually get the money in the pockets of people so they can consume more. Because the model you have now in many ways is very low interest rates, companies find it easy to produce, again, another cement plant, another chemical plant, another car manufacturer, the feared overcapacity all of us are talking about, that in many cases then spills over and harms international trade. So to go into kind of get more money, get the interest rates higher, get more money into the pockets of people so they can spend more, consume more, buy more products, value services more. This is nothing that can happen overnight, certainly not over the next 1 or 2 years. This is a decade task, and I don't fancy the new leadership to take on this task.
Thank you. One of the key criteria, or one of the key targets of China, on Chinese government, is to build an innovative society. That's the new growth model. Move away from the Werkbank der Welt, from the engine for manufacturing, moving into a higher level, like we all aspire to, into an innovative society. So the next round of question to both of you is, what does it take to become an innovative society? What is needed in China? Is there any change needed on the level of the companies, of the government, of the rules, of the state, of the law? What do you think? How do we become an innovative society?
It's a cliche that Chinese people are not very innovative. They just copy.
No, this is only short term. On the long term, they have been very innovative.
Yeah, that's my point.
We have to go back to the long term.
That's my point, actually. I think Chinese people are very innovative, no more but no less than other nations. I can give you an example. It's a weird example. I think everybody heard the name of Jeremy Lin, the new basketball star at NBA, is rising star.
Yeah, the rising Chinese star in American basketball,
yeah,
Jeremy Lin.
That's right. He was nobody. He was a star this year, but he was a nobody last year. But even he was a nobody, some businesswoman in China saw him play basketball on TV, and then she registered a trademark using Jeremy Lin's name in China. It's not because that this businesswoman is particularly farsighted. She couldn't expect Jeremy Lin to be a star today. It's just because she didn't want to leave anything to chance. In China's sportswear industry, there is a systematic effort to register any famous sport person around the world, to register their name as trademark in China. And it's exhaustive. It's so exhaustive that most recently, Michael Jordan, the famous Michael Jordan, sued a Chinese company, sued a company in China. Guess guess the name of this company? Jordan Sports. And Jordan claimed he didn't care about money, he just wants his name back. as well as the name of two of his sons, because these Jordan sports also register the name of two of Mr. Jordan's sons as trademark in China. In defense of its so-called own IPRs. It's weird, it's demonic, but it's also innovative, right? It's extremely innovative at copying, you can even call stealing something, right? And sorry.
Translation.
But the point is, this is where the easy money made in China. That's why Chinese business community are so good at doing this kind of business practices. And at the end of the day, it's because the rule of law in China does not protect innovative action. Innovation doesn't pay out. That's why Chinese business is so innovative at copying today. China has joined all major international IPR treaties. But the problem is that to make that functional, we need an independent, professional, and efficient legal system to work. Sadly, we lack that.
So your comment focuses on the individual and the individual company, saying that innovation might not yet pay off. It might not be the environment for the individual. How about the state? The state-sponsored innovation? Is there another level of innovation where you say the state encourages innovation more at the state-owned level rather than an individual level?
There is a phrase in China called indigenous innovation. I think that's self-contradictory because innovation doesn't recognize border, right? Innovation comes from anywhere. Indigenous innovation means that government put huge subsidies to promote national champions to do so-called innovation. I can give you an example. Most recently, there is a wind power equipment company get listed in last year in Shanghai market. It's called Sinovel. That company has only 5 years history, but at the first day of its being listed, its capitalization reached around 100 billion yuan, a very, very big capitalization. It enjoys all the benefits from this so-called state-sponsored innovation policies, a lot of subsidies, a lot of preferential treatments from all levels of governments. But then, suddenly, the government policy shifts. Wind power is no longer the favorable new energy sector of Chinese government. Other new energy sector replaces its place. And suddenly, this company loses half of its capitalization. And all the new investors has lost their shares. So if you rely on the state-sponsored, so-called state-sponsored innovation, it's become too unpredictable because government's behavior is unpredictable. The reason why this wind power sector is no longer favored by the government is the reason is very simple, because a key high-ranking government official has left his post. That's the reason.
So the innovation might come from state-sponsored innovation, might come from the individual. There was one author once who said that China is like a big private equity fund, a giant venture capital fund. It can afford to spend so much money on innovation where only part is successful and the other part goes down, like Mr. Wang says? Jörg, what do you say?
Well, China gets labeled in many forms. I agree with Mr. Wang, as if it's state-sponsored, it might carry some distance and then sort of it breaks apart. I mean, we have seen state-sponsored innovation in the Soviet Union, and they're still driving the Moscovich. So nothing to worry about there. I think that it's not the Chinese individual that is at fault, because there's a lot of brain power between their ears, certainly. 50%, half of all the science and technology PhDs in the United States universities are done by mainland Chinese. That just shows you the ability that these people have. Now, how come that all of a sudden you have California coming up with these great products, and in China we still wait for this product that we buy on the shelf and is clearly made in China, made by Chinese, innovated by Chinese? Possibly it's the system. It is a system which actually doesn't breed innovation, because it shelters competition, state-owned enterprises. Capital is too cheap, meaning why should you come up with something new if basically money is around the corner? Labor is too cheap. It's not a conducive, positive environment for innovation, I'm afraid. Also, IPR laws are not very good. And the companies that suffer from that is the private enterprises. You hear always foreign companies complain about violation of IPRs, but actually 95% of all cases in Chinese courts on IPR is Chinese against Chinese. It's private companies trying to hang in. They put in their soul, they put in the money, and then they get copied by someone else and they lose everything. The sad story is that, yes, this country is full of innovation potential, but at this stage it has very little traction in order to make this happen. What would make this happen is what makes it happen here in this country. It's competition, it's transparency, and it is the rule of law. Meaning that you know you're protected and you will have to be better than your competitor in order to get there. China is a highly competitive environment in not the right context. It is still sheltering the big ones and basically has hyper competition on the private sector. So in a way, to make this change the system is not to pour more money at the whole economy. This indigenous innovation Mr. Wang was talking about, in order to come up with 2 or 3% of GDP, oh my God, everything is going to be Chinese in the future. If you put water on sand, it doesn't grow anything. So what it takes is a change in system, rules of law, basically having a trust between universities and companies, which actually is one of those growth drivers in this country, that companies can work with universities and they know they're not going to leak this, and the universities know the company is going to pay for this. This is not common in China. So nothing to worry, I think, from a German point of view, but actually it's a pity that China doesn't innovate and develop these products, because in many ways we would need innovation from China in order to have Chinese products that make our life richer and better.
Let's come to the second part of the title of this evening, which is the rising global economy, China's rising global economy. And let's look into two ways. The one, foreign investment going into China since 30 years or 20 years or 25, and China going abroad, China going out, as the official term is, and how we see this. Let's first come to foreign investment into China, which we have seen now for 3 decades, starting in the 80s, where China was eager to attract foreign technology and capital, something we can't even dream of these days, that China still needs capital, you know. So at that time it needed capital and technology. Then later on we moved to a period in the 90s and early of this century where there was a kind of a market economy movement of moving around the foreign companies and Chinese companies and cooperating. And now China seems to be a bit more selective again in what foreign investment it wants to attract or not. So what do you think is China's perception of foreign companies in China? Did it change? Does it still need us? Is there a different view on it these days than it was 10 years ago?
It's impossible to overestimate the importance of FDI into China.
FDI is foreign direct investment, just for the translation.
As you have just said, that FDI into China, I think, brought 2 vital capital to China. The first capital is financial capital, which was vital 20 or 30 years ago because we lacked capital at that time. It's less important today, but still important. And the second capital is I call it institutional capital, which means human capital, management expertise, and global strategy, global vision, something like that. They are even more important today than before because Chinese companies are starting to go onto the international stage, and these are precisely the things that they need to learn from. And I think that there are also another dimension to view multinationals in China, that they have a unique role to push China to adopt international practices. For example, one of the major requests of multinationals in China today is that Chinese government should join the government procurement agreement under WTO. If that really happened, that not only will benefit the multinationals tremendously, but also will benefit all other market players except those very, very privileged ones.
So the Government Procurement Act, for those of you who are not in the business, is the international agreement on how companies shall be treated when they bid for public projects. And since this is such a huge business in China, public projects, that it's a scale completely different from public procurement in our country. So the fact that foreign companies cannot participate has been a long issue here.
Multinationals used to enjoy, I think, in the first 20 years of China's opening up, I think multinationals in China enjoys supranational treatment. Their treatment, they received treatment better than local companies in China. Today, things has greatly changed. I think Joe noted very clearly. I think today, generally speaking, that multinationals in China is more regarded as competitors other than capital providers, which as these old rules. As competitors, multinationals today, I think, among all kinds of companies in China, state-owned enterprises, privately owned enterprises, foreign companies, these three companies, I think multinational foreign companies enjoy less protections from the government. I'll give you an example. If a strike broke out, if the worker go on striking at a SOE, state-owned enterprise, it is usually being harshly treated. But if workers go on striking at a foreign company in Guangdong, in Zhejiang, usually it get relatively good treatment, and usually it will reach compromise with the company owners, which will benefit, which will meet a lot of workers' demands. But this kind of things not necessarily happen to workers in state-owned enterprises or even privately owned enterprises.
So we moved away from supranational treatment for foreign enterprises. We moved into equal treatment with Chinese enterprises. Question mark?
Not really. No, I think that I agree with Mr. Wang. At the beginning, the door was wide open. Tax treatment was positive. The government wanted to have the blue chips like Siemens or Volkswagen or BASF in the country. And of course, then after a while, the local competition came up, and then they say, so why should we just leave this market to the foreigners? Let's sort of squeeze them in a corner, develop our own guys, and then at the end, when we have learned from those fellows, let's kick them out. We're not there yet, but we fear it sometimes because, I mean, the Government Procurement Act, for example, which is, as Mr. Stricker-Kellerer said, in a magnitude of 90 billion euro, this is 3 times the GDP of Bulgaria we are talking about, is now basically targeted only for Chinese companies. And the most recent development was, for example, on cars, where the government now made a new plan on saying, you know, we only buy Chinese cars, meaning not joint ventures, so 40% Audi, 60% Chinese, or 50% Volkswagen, 50% Chinese, only Chinese, which is a development just 2 weeks ago, which makes us all puzzled, like, so if we invest in China, how come we're not Chinese? Something that Prime Minister said 2 years ago very clearly is, when you invest in China, you're going to be Chinese. So in other words, if you produce a Ford in Cologne, you cannot sell it to the police because it's state-owned. Subsidy out of this. So we worry about this access. We worry about the door closing shut. And we see a group of Chinese leaders coming in that actually worry as well, luckily for us, and sees that competition is good, that foreign investment still brings better environmental control, better corporate governance, and so forth. So China has not basically gone down the road is only for Chinese, but we see some areas which is more difficult. It depends on the segment you're working in. But at the same time, some leaders have realized that foreign investment is still needed for the management skills and for the corporate governance. So the verdict is out there. We hope this side was going to win.
So where is this relevant other than foreign investment going into China? It's also relevant for the second part. What we wanted to talk is Chinese going out, Chinese companies going abroad. We always talk about fairness and, you know, what can we do in China as foreign companies? What can the Chinese companies do here? So this is a whole basket of discussion. So Chinese companies now going out, going to Europe, buying companies in Europe, where we, you know, welcome the initiative, welcome the fresh capital coming in, and welcome the restructuring for some of the companies we need. But there is still quite a different perception of what the Chinese companies and the Chinese players think how Europe is, how Europe looks like, how difficult it is, or what the European companies fear, or what the media fear might happen when the Chinese companies come here. So let's start with the Chinese perception. What do the Chinese companies worry about when they become global and go to Europe? Let's focus only on Europe. Let's forget about the other countries for a moment.
We Chinese always remember the first big international merger case, which never happened, coming out of China. Is Sinop's acquisition of Unocal in 2005. It failed. A lot of many.
Let us just say that was an acquisition the Chinese had planned in the United States, which failed for security interest reasons, or only for the business reasons? For many reasons. Okay, political intervention, but that was at the beginning of the century. When was that?
2005.
2005. Okay.
2005. That teaches going out Chinese business a lesson that international merger and acquisition could be very politicized. But I don't think that political risk is the single most important risk for Chinese companies going international. I think the largest risk coming from the Chinese company itself is naive belief that it can simply copy its working model inside China to other markets. For example, most Chinese business leaders believe that in China, inside China, if you can secure government's goodwill, then everything else will follow. But this thing simply don't happen in Europe, right? You secure government approval, you have to appease to every other stakeholders individually. And also, some business, and also if a Chinese CEO think that he can copy his low-cost production model to Europe, to acquire a company, to acquire a factory and then lay off the workers and replace them with low-cost laborers. Think again, think hard. It won't happen. And And there is also another dimension of Chinese companies' strategy going international. That is, we read a cover story about this kind. Follow this dimension. It's about international brokers coming out of China. They are for. I'm sorry, I have to rephrase this. Sorry. There are another dimension of this Chinese company going out, that all of the international investment from Chinese companies need government approval, whatever it is. To go out, it needs approval from NDRC, the Central Planning Committee of Chinese government. This means that the government decision could distort the business decision. First, the government could veto the application. Second, increasingly, more and more the case that more than one Chinese companies competing the same target overseas. I remember several months ago, 2 Chinese companies competing for a Germany heavy work company here, and all of them should need a government approval, and the government usually choose one over the other competitors for whatever reason the government likes. It make business decision instead of in the place of the business itself. And also, in some cases, governments give too good incentives to the companies going international, too good to refuse. And so these companies may go out only because of these incentives. These are all potential pitfalls.
So going global starts at home.
Yes,
that is your message. Going global starts at home, both from the regulatory environment.
And distortion also comes
And distortion can start at home.
Yes.
Do you think there is a different weight whether I'm a private company or a state-owned company?
Private company, all state-owned companies, all need government approval to go outside. Otherwise, they can't get currency, they can't get any help. It's impossible to happen.
What are the key obstacles to Chinese growth abroad?
Well, let me phrase this. I mean, first of all, investment abroad is a good thing. Investment of Chinese companies in Germany is a good thing. Brings money, brings jobs, and in many cases, you have seen some Chinese buying, especially Southwest German companies that link them up to the Chinese market, especially as German SMEs that where the owner doesn't have the ability to carry on, and then they took over. Actually, there are quite some good case studies. So overall, so far, the experience with Chinese investors in Germany has been rather on the positive side in most cases. What is the problem is, of course, twofold. First of all, the Chinese are going to come big time. If most of you, I can see, are old enough to remember the 80s, the Japanese are coming. And worry. And especially in America, you know, by the Rockefeller Center, they're going to buy our last shirt and we're all going to go down. Didn't happen. And now the Chinese are around the corner. The renminbi is going to appreciate. The Chinese companies get bigger. They ask for technology. They ask for markets. Europe happens to be the biggest market in the world. So, of course, we're target number one. And so, yes, they're going to come, but they're ill-prepared. They have approval, maybe. They have the cash, definitely. There's no shortage of cash in China these days, but they have no management skills in many ways. So to go abroad, to go from a province of Henan, which, by the way, has 100 million people, and to move your company into Hamburg, which obviously you don't regard as a low-cost base, you need a lot of skills in language, culture. You need very expensive advisors, as Madame Stricker, of course, and you need a lot of people that educate you on the labor laws, environmental laws. I know you're not that expensive, but so you have to sort of link up with the market. But there is very few companies that can actually manage. So at this stage, Hamburg has 300, 400 Chinese companies, mostly in traders. and in many ways very successful, but not real investment as maybe that's the next wave. But again, the problem we have is that the Chinese CEOs think about, oh, let's just move there, and then have massive failures. We had big-time failures of Chinese investment in France. TCL bought Alcatel, went down. TCL bought Thomson, terrible. And now they basically have learned from this and says, watch out, these guys have trade unions that bite, that actually talk back. Something they could have learned by consultants already. But it is the biggest problem I see is the political dimension. The Chinese are coming, let's close our doors, which would be terrible. And the second is, if the Chinese manage to get through the door, that actually they can't manage this and leave behind rotten M&As, rotten companies, and so forth. So my hope really is that the Chinese business organizations, the German chambers, educate Chinese companies that want to come here, prepare them, so actually there is a win-win, meaning we get the jobs and the investment, and they get the profit and the returns in order to continue.
So it's basically, getting out of the vicious cycle. We have unsuccessful cases, which makes it even more difficult to get the approval back home, because back home, the state might be more nervous about it, and the more nervous it gets, the less competitive the bidders get. But we have lots of money, so could money pay? At least for the transition period.
I mean, look at Opel, for example. I mean, Opel is the case, sort of, it's too important to die, but it's not healthy enough to keep it alive. So it's in the. Of course, everybody looks to Beijing, and Beijing, actually, international automotive company BRK has looked at Opel, and has shied away from this one. But in many ways, I mean, the Opel produces cars that would be extremely successful in China because the shape, because what kind of quality they are. So in many ways, it would be great to have them linked up and put up money in Rüsselsheim and link them up. But it's not happening yet because they are afraid to put the money in there because, first of all, it belongs to General Motors, and secondly, of the trade unions and all of these things a bit. But in many ways, as you can see in Volvo was a bankrupt Swedish company. They took it over from Ford and have pretty much installed a German president for Volvo, Mr. Jacobi, and has basically managed to actually turn this company around and make this, link it up to sell now from virtually 3,000 cars to China. Now the target is 300,000 cars. And there you can see the success around the corner. So let's hope that Volvo works out. Let's hope that maybe at one stage Chinese comes down the road and buys up Opel in Rüsselsheim.
And I think this generation of Chinese entrepreneurs has been learning from their mistakes. As Joke has said, Li Dongsen's TCL's disaster in France was replaced by Li Shufu's acquisition of Volvo, Geely's acquisition of Volvo. Li Shu, the founder of Geely is very, very clever. I'll give you an example. He signed an agreement with Volvo that he will not poach Volvo's engineering talents. But then the engineers of Volvo will retire. And after they retire, they are hired by the founder of Geely to work in China, to work for Geely. So in this way, they integrate the operation smoothly and improve Geely's own production line tremendously.
Which is just fine, because it's the parent and the child. And the parent has any right to learn from its child, yes. Okay, I think we have, it's 8 o'clock now, so we are allowed to open the floor for your questions, and are delighted to take your questions and try to answer them. Please, whatever question you have, you can raise them in either English or German. I'll do the translation for Mr. Wang Shuo. We left out quite a number of issues, so there is so much ground still to cover.
I heard some time ago, or I read in a paper, that the Chinese government is getting short of money. because they spent so much, gave a lot of money to the companies and spent a lot of money on, like you said before, on streets and ports and cities. And do you know anything about that?
I think this newspaper is talking about the debt of the local governments, and I think that's true. At local levels, the governments don't have enough fiscal tax revenue resources, but they need to deal with they need to build the local infrastructure. That's why they rely heavily on banking loans and other revenue resources. But for the central government, it's totally different story. In the past 10 years, the tax revenue of the central government has been growing at around 30% for each year. It's at least two times of the GDP growth, maybe 3 times. So this central government is fiscally speaking, is the strongest central government ever in China, maybe around the world, I don't know. But it doesn't lack money.
Yeah, maybe let me just step in there. China at this stage has a very, very bad fiscal system. 30%, 40% of the income of a province or a city comes from the central government. And that actually distorts the whole thing. So in short, basically every province looks a little bit like Greece. But don't worry, you know, they have this superpower, Beijing, that sort of distributes the money. But actually, if you would permit these provinces to raise the money by bonds, to keep these taxes they're actually generating in the province, virtually all provinces, I would say, are probably rather profitable. The fiscal system is a huge problem in China.
Question far at the back.
Hello, good evening. I have a question for Mr. Wang. So I'm very interested in the first topic about the society and innovative. So I think the future of China is really based on the development and the development of the social dignity, the fairness and so on. So there is a question to Mr. Wang. You say, first of all, are you meaning the innovative? Oh, this microphone is really crazy.
Fine.
I cannot even hear my own voice.
No, we can hear you.
We can hear you well.
Keep
Go
on
ahead.
talking. Okay. So I think there is one thing to clarify. What is the innovative and the creative? So what you are saying maybe is more like, let's say, the creativity is based on the freedom of the society. Because I'm a Chinese, I'm original from Shanghai. I've been living in Germany for 10 years. I really understand what Mr. The gentleman from BASF says. You cannot pour the water on the sand. There's no society, no surrounding, no system to breed innovation. But the question to Mr. Wang, I think you are a really fan. Maybe you are a big fan of the right development strategy of China right now. So how do you think? How can people be really creative if the social system or the political system doesn't really allow people to be creative? You cannot ask people to have fun, to be creative, under the enforcement. So how do you think? Where's I'm quite, curious. How can people be more creative under that social system?
Thank you for giving me this chance to clarify myself. First, I want to say that a good system should discourage the behavior I just mentioned, the Jordan sports in China. That kind of behavior should be discouraged by a properly functional legal system. And second, to make things better, to make Chinese business people or ordinary Chinese people to be more creative, doesn't need total reshuffle of the whole system. I think that gradual change, marginal change, will mean that. To promote creativity in China, there's need only one thing, that is rule of law, to protect IPR, to help those creative people to make money. Making money really counts, is what really counts in China today. And if you can make easy money by copying, you will never be creative. You will never want to be creative. You will never want to be another Steve Jobs. You will simply create another Jordan Sports across the country. So, rule of law, first of all, rule of law, and a functional legal system is a key to innovation in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. Gentleman near the window and then the gentleman in front of him. No, the other way. Okay.
Dankeschön. Ich habe eine Frage einmal zur gesellschaftlichen Veränderung. Ich bin 1959 mit dem Schiff das erste Mal in China gewesen. Und da hatte ich den Eindruck, dass ein recht harmonisches Arbeitsverhältnis in China herrschte. Aber ich habe gehört, dass so in den letzten Jahren die Streiks Anzahl auf 30.000 pro Jahr angestiegen ist. Und da frage ich mich, ob es tatsächlich ausreichend ist, dass man nur in ausländischen Firmen stärker auf gewerkschaftliche Rechte vielleicht achtet und bei staatlichen Unternehmen nicht mehr. Muss nicht noch mehr tun. Gerade wenn man daran erinnert, dass in China 200 Millionen Wanderarbeiter wohl immer noch vorhanden sind. Und muss man da nicht irgendwie mit den Arbeitsrechten irgendwie stärker drauf eingehen?
Okay, let me try to translate for Mr. Wang. The gentleman has been in China on a ship in 1959, and at that time it was a very peaceful social environment, and he was wondering whether we have a rather litigious society now, that we have so many disputes, and I think he mostly referred to labor unrest, if I'm not mistaken, and whether we need more protection for the migrant workers and the social tensions arising there. Did I get it right, Jörg?
More or less, yes.
Okay, cool. Correct me, please.
No, maybe I can. Well, 59 is a long time ago. It's actually sort of.
You were hardly
I'm
born,
sorry
right?
to say it's my age, but so my head's off that you went to China at that time. Very unusual. I think that what you're pointing is the big problem this society is facing, that so far cheap labor and the kind of willingness of 18 to 35-year-old women to work in sweatshops, willingness of 18 to 35-year-old young men to be exploited on construction site is coming luckily to an end. And the riots and the kind of issues that you raised actually is a good sign that people dare to speak up, and actually people feel that labor laws are coming up. The laws sometimes in China are wonderful. The legal system actually has on paper a lot of rights. And now some of these people take these rights, but there's a lot of pushback from party, from owners, and so forth. But the problem is also in China is even if the laws are wonderful, there are not enough judges, there are not enough lawyers, there are not enough courts to look after this. They are swamped in cases. And there is no tradition of fairness, you know. So in a way, that's going to take a long time. But I think the good news is that actually in the top leadership, and especially in Guangdong province, where they have possibly an incoming top politician who is now running the southern province of Guangdong, again, 80 million people, Mr. Wang Yang, who actually, when there was a riot in the city of Wukang, was not just cracking down, sending in the police and shutting it down and so forth. Actually, he was encouraging communication and engagement and so forth. But again, this is one province and one guy trying to do it differently. So let's hope that this is going to go nationwide. This system there has not experience of that sort of engagement, participation, trade unions and the like, and it's going to take a while. But at least the good news is some realize this. Migrant workers is something that is actually coming to an end. It used to be 200 million, 150, now I think maybe we talk 100 million. The good news is why it comes to an end is the interior provinces where these people come from are getting richer, and people say, hey, why should I get exploited in a sweatshop or in construction in Guangdong? I just stay in Hunan province and work there and have a better life. So the Guangdong province factory owners are screaming, possibly saving, I mean, if you read Gerhard Hauptmann's Weber, you know what happens there. They're screaming, but I mean, it's the right thing for these workers to say, guy, why should I go and work in a company for that long for no money, maybe? So I think the development in China is very challenging for the leadership because what also is changing the expectation of people. In the old days, 10 years ago, if you're better off tomorrow than today, then actually you're fine. And basically, many, especially the middle class and migrant workers have passed this. It's going to be a far more difficult country to rule.
I totally agree with Georg. I just want to add a few words that 1959 is not a harmonious society. It's the beginning of the great leap forward and the beginning of the truly tragedy and the disaster.
Herr Wang, ich habe eine Frage zu den 80 Milliarden Militärausgaben, die im neuen Haushalt sind. Gegen wen sind die gerichtet? Könnten Sie vielleicht über die Kolonialpolitik in Afrika ein paar Worte verlieren? Und dann sind genauso 80 Milliarden für die innere Sicherheit. Und Sie sagten ja selber, dass von den 3 Herausforderungen 2 sozialer Natur sind. Würden Sie da sagen, man versucht, das Soziale in den Griff zu kriegen über Wachstum? Es sollen aber, wenn Sie sagen 7,5% Wachstum, 4% davon erforderlich sein, um die Umweltschäden in den Griff zu kriegen. Da bleiben noch 3,5 über. Damit haben Sie die riots on the street.
Okay, the question is about the military budget and the budget for the internal security. And what this money is for, what it's directed for. Jörg, help me. I didn't take notes. And
I think that covers it.
Whether the environmental damage, you know, because out of the 7.5 gross percentage, you need already 4 to undo the environmental damage, and whether that's part of it. So these were the 3 things: military budget, internal security, and environmental damages. And the African colonial politics. Who wants to take a hit first?
Well, let me
start. Let's do global economy. Let's do more Africa then.
Right. Let me start with Africa. First of all, yes, 80 billion sounds like a lot, but if you have basically a country of a continent size and you virtually have 16 or 17 neighbor countries, some of them are quite volatile, like Afghanistan, China neighbors on Afghanistan, and Pakistan and so forth. Actually, the figure is not that high anymore. It is worrisome for the neighboring countries because the leaps are big. It's 16%, 17%, 18%. And China has, unfortunately, over the last 2 years, projected itself a more aggressive stance in its verbal, in its attire. They have realized that, but fact is that the money is spent on an army which in many ways is still rather technology backward. And if you consider that the United States of America, that has 2 neighbors that are very friendly, spends basically 3 times that money on its army, that puts it a bit into perspective. On the interior security, that is a major point, and you wonder why a country of that size needs as much on the interior security as it needs on the outside security. That's a long discussion point. Apparently, the leadership feels worried and subsequently spends the money on prevention, whatever it is. On the Africa policy, I think there is no Africa policy. It's just a lot of Chinese companies going out in order to buy commodities like gas, oil, iron ore, timber, and so forth in Africa. And so it looks like from the outside like there's a combined Chinese policy. You all go to Sudan, you all go to Africa, and we're going to follow you up. From my experience, and I work in the oil sector, it's exactly the other way around. These guys go out, buy oil fields and gas fields and whatnot, and the government sort of the flag follows behind it, which cause a lot of resentments and problems. But at the same time, with all the challenges that sometimes Chinese companies have in executing projects in some African countries, such as Zambia, at the same time, if the Chinese that have already now a demand structure of 8 to 9 million barrels a day of oil, if they don't start drilling in so-called difficult countries where our companies don't go, what are they going to do? They're not going to find more oil, so they're going to buy it on the world market more. So if China doesn't invest in commodities, and they should invest, to our calculation, $200 to $300 billion a year in order to find oil and gas, it's going to go on the same market. Competition is going to be tougher, and the prices for us on gas and oil is going to be sky high. So in many ways, we can encourage the Chinese to go out more and find more oil and gas on their own in order to not put the pressure on us having the same gas or oil supplies. But at the same time, also, the way they do it is, of course, a challenge. So I understand where you come from. There has been challenges, but again, that's sometimes more based on inexperience than anything else.
I want to add a few words that I think the quarterly policy is exaggeration because first, there's no quarterly policy whatsoever. Second, I think the Chinese companies advance in Africa is first is diversified. Second, its achievements has been hugely overestimated. According to my colleagues, journalists interview with the Chinese companies, their African business are full of frustration and the failed projects and the failed bids. Only in a few specific countries can they get some foothold. It's far from being a huge success of getting energy or resource supply at Africa. It's not a success story. It's a story full of frustration and failure so far. That's why I think back in China, people are starting to debate whether it's a good policy or it's a good policy or not.
Would you agree to Jörg's comment that there is no policy, that basically the company is going out on their own initiative, or would you find a strategic plan behind that?
I think every major, yes, I don't think that there is a unified policy from the top level. I don't think there is anything like that. For some national oil companies, of course, they want to get more oil or gas resources from Africa, and they try their best to persuade the government to support them. Of course, they want to keep a cheap credit, and more government subsidies. But for private-owned enterprises, they need to be very smart in their approach. Otherwise, they will be in big trouble. I give you an example of a smart approach by a Chinese company. It will never go into an African country blindly. It will always go behind a major company such as Sinopec. If Sinopec get a big project somewhere, this private company is a heavyweight company, will follow up and to do the infrastructure building for Sinopec. That only in this way can this company can gain a foothold in that country.
Anita?
I thought I was the next online. Can you hear it? Yes. A short question. We saw in the last year that Chinese companies are trying to go more to high tech, to own developments. Do you think that this development will go to more protection for intellectual properties from inside China? We are always complaining from the outside that it's not protected. Do you think there's any development from inside China to make pressure on the government to protect even the Chinese companies in this way?
Your question is whether there is inside pressure upon Chinese government to protect IPR of Chinese companies, right?
Right.
I think most recently there is a legal fight between Apple Inc. and Taiwan company, but based in Shenzhen. This company from Taiwan, registered and based in Shenzhen, owns the trademark of iPad in China. It sued Apple Inc. for, I don't know how much. Somebody argued it's around 10 billion yuan. And this is a very complicated legal fight. At least in one side of this fight, this local company get the support of one local court, which temporarily forbid iPad sale in China. But of course, this fight this legal fight is still an ongoing fight, and then later another court reversed the verdict, so we can continue to buy iPad in China, fortunately. But things are very complicated in China. That I think to protect IPR protection is not an issue of protection of only local or only international IPR. If IPR protection is improved in China, it's good news to both foreign and local companies, local innovative companies.
Corinna Nienstedt, representing the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce. I have a question regarding China's perception of the current situation in Europe. We in the Chamber, we felt really strong worries, even anger, from the Chinese government as well as from the Chinese companies as far as the Euro crisis is concerned, saying that Europe is a developed country or a developed area and they should really start solving their problems at home in Europe. So my question would be, do you share this impression? How is the current perception of Europe as a political and economic zone?
I think a lot of ordinary Chinese people believed that to bail out, the so-called bailing out the Eurozone first is a waste of money, and second, unfair to ordinary Chinese people because we are so poor and you are so rich. But if you look at the situation more carefully, you will know that European economy and the Chinese economy are so closely connected that if Chinese government decide to do something to help Europe, it is also helping itself. But so far, the top leaders of China has been saying that they want to help, but they want to help. But on the condition, first that the European countries find a solution among themselves first. I think it's a reasonable condition, right? and second, they want to do this through a multilateral organization like IMF, and I think that's also understandable. So I think the ball is on your side now.
Let me say that sometimes my impression in China is that the Chinese government thinks exactly like my neighbors in my hometown in Heidelberg, meaning fix yourself first, and again, then show that your willingness in order to fix itself, and then we step in. And that's how also China looks at Europe. In a way, they look at Europe in a twofold setting. On the one hand, the northern countries, which they marvel about how they fix their economy and how well they're doing, especially a shining example is Germany. At the same time, they look at the southern countries, what we in derogatory terms call the Club Med. So Greek and Italy and Portugal sort of is the country where I think, my God, so is there any chance to fix them? And so the Chinese government says, first of all, rightfully, I think, we are a developing country. Yes, we have $3 trillion US dollars foreign exchange reserves. But how should we fix a country that has 3 or 4 times the GDP per capita than China? So why should we spend the money on Madrid or Barcelona if we have areas which are very much lagging behind? But I think the Chinese government understands, as Mr. Wang says, that Europe is the biggest and most important market for them, with 500 million customers. So they have every interest in order to make Europe go strong. So I think they decided, we are not going to buy Greek bonds, we are not going to buy Italian bonds, we'll possibly put the money into German bonds, or if there's such a thing like Swedish bonds. But let's buy assets. Let's buy electricity grid in Portugal. Let's buy a port in Greece. Let's buy this in Italy. Let's buy that in another country. So let's have real assets that we can control, and meaning they have faith in this part of Europe. And assuming that the rest of Europe that is doing economically well, everything above the Alps more or less, is going to actually fix it, and that then Europe is going to continue. So on the one hand, they look at Europe as most important. They see that there are some challenges. They simply have no political will to spend the money on it. And yes, they are angry about the much of talks, but like many of us, who's to blame them?
Yes, please. Where the nearest mic is for the gentleman here. Okay, you start first, and then these 2 remaining questions. We have only a few more minutes left. The lady here and the gentleman there. Yeah.
I remember one of the speakers mentioned that one of the key factors for China's economy to grow continuously is let Chinese people to consume more for the consumer. I have a question for our tradition. Tell us that we should save more for our future and for our next generation. And given the fact that real estate is really the price of real estate is still rocketing, how could we tell people we should spend more money and to consume more? How can we do that in the next decades? How can we encourage them?
Thank you very much for the question. Jörg.
Well, first of all, the saving rate of the individuals in China is very, very low. There is this cultural perception that Chinese save, work hard, and save more. But frankly, these poor fellows have negative deposit rates. So if you put your money in the bank, you get 2.5%. Inflation rate for a while was 6%, now is going down to 4, 3 point something. So every month you lose money. So first of all, it is a subsidy system where at this stage, people put money, Mr. Wang and Mrs. Li put money in the bank in order to finance the SOEs or the companies to have cheap money. This has to stop. The interest rates have to go up at one stage in order to give the people some decent returns. Because the difficulty in China is how to invest, how to actually, as an individual, put your money somewhere where it's decent. So China, as a matter of fact, is not really saving a lot of money. The saving rate of individuals in India is higher than in China. And the second thing is that the saving rate in China is 50% of GDP, as everybody knows, but 30% of this is government and companies. So around 20% is individuals. So actually it's very little. So the trick in China is to make these companies actually contribute more to the economy. Frankly, in China, the SOEs don't pay dividends. So they make a lot of money, keep the money, and basically put it into another projects. The dividend payment is the most crucial reform. The SOEs have to be treated like real companies and not like government fiefdoms. So there is a big attempt in many of the Chinese leaders now to go for this, and in order to then use this money and put the dividends of Chinese companies into pension, into healthcare, into school reforms, so that actually people have to worry less about their future. Because in China, if you're sick, there is no real insurance in many areas in China, you're really in trouble. School fees are sky high in many ways, and any visit and pension, the pension scheme in China at this stage, if you take every urban worker, it's $400 US for the rest of your life. Even in China, that doesn't get you far.
You want to add something? Okay. So we have the last question of the evening.
Vielen Dank. Also meine Frage ist an Herrn Wuttke und bezieht sich auf die chinesischen Unternehmen nach Ausland. Also vor einiger Zeit hat ein chinesisches Unternehmen Sanyi, also das deutsche Unternehmen Putzmeister gekauft. Also wie bemerken Sie das? Und wie wir wissen, BASF ist sehr erfolgreich in China. Und was für Vorschläge haben Sie für die chinesischen Unternehmen, die nach Außenland, also nach EU, Europa wollen? Also vielen Dank.
Yeah, the Putzmeister deal is very interesting because actually, as far as I know, it's not concluded. Frankly, as Mr. Wang was talking about it, the Chinese government approved another Chinese company to buy Putzmeister, but just Sunny came in last minute in order to took this deal. Actually, Sunny is a very good private-owned company that has an amazing market share and quite a very, very charismatic and engaging CEO. So Sunny actually is a good company. I think for Putzmeister it was a good deal in many ways, as construction is happening far more in China than in Germany. So if you link up the Putzmeister technology gains with the market in China, again, every year, at one time New York is being built for Betonmischmaschinen and stuff like that. Sorry, but this is the right market. So Putzmeister actually has the technologies to serve an urbanization process in China, because except the Elbe-Gebäude next door, there's not that much construction going on here in this country. So realistically speaking, and I think even you guys will be finished at one stage. So in a way, I think it's a good thing that Sunny invested here. I hope this uncertainty about who really is going to buy Putzmeister is going to be solved. What recommendation I can give to Chinese companies, besides contracting very expensive lawyers, of course, is to actually really go into the pool of German-speaking Chinese or into people that actually can communicate between these cultures, which is very vital. In order to make them understand how the German market ticks, how the German laws apply, how the German corporate governance works out. To be just successful in some province in China, to project yourself, you know, I have the right product, I have the money, no problem, I'm going to do it here, is bound to fail. There is a great Roland Berger study on Chinese companies going global. And it exactly shows the problem is the Chinese CEOs see money, product, and this is going to make my market. And the Roland Berger study has very clearly shown cultures first. How do we fit? And everybody who has seen German-French joint ventures knows exactly what culture problems can arise.
No. Okay, so we come to a close, and I want to ask a last question to my wonderful panelists. We have the Chinese leadership change coming up in fall. So you're both sitting as the two new leaders. And concerning China's economy, you can only make two very first decisions. So you have two decisions to make, how to stimulate the growth and how to move things forward. What would be your priority decisions?
Actually, I think I have already given the answer during my talks.
First, so again, just to make the conclusion, give it again.
First, rule of law. Second, if I have to choose from my three suggestions, this unified, nationwide, portable social security system.
Rule of law and social security system. Your two jobs?
If I would be in their shoes, I would quit same day, frankly. Given the enormity of the job. Well, frankly speaking, the recommendations are out there. Just last week, the World Bank published their study 2030. It was done with the State Council Development Research Center. So it's a combined study. And it exactly lines out what you have to do in order to not become a Japan big scale, and not to become a middle income trapped country. All the problems the world can line out. If you don't reform, then you're going to be toast. And so you have the ability, you have still a window of opportunity to reform yourself. Again, the dividends of the state enterprises, the rule of law that's coming up. But this is not going to happen over the next days. So I think that the government in China has in writing pretty much what it has to do, but does it have the political will to tackle that and to go after interest groups that actually prevent these reforms from being implemented because people cashed in a lot of money? There's a lot of rich people. 40 members of the National People's Congress Parliament have $10 billion assets each, 40 of them. So there is an amazing divergence of rich and poor. So the answers are there, but is the political will there? So given what I see from these leaders, possibly yes.
Thank you very much. Before we conclude, I want to have one very special round of applause from you. Mr. Wang Shuo said today that he has been traveling extensively, and I know, and of course his magazine has very global coverage. He's an extensive traveler, but it's his first day in Hamburg and his first day in Germany, so I wish him all the best and hope that this leaves him with the impression to come back again.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich darf noch eine kurze Ankündigung machen. Die nächste Veranstaltung in der Reihe hier in Hamburg zum Thema Magnet China findet statt am 26. Juni. Wir werden uns dann beschäftigen mit der Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik Chinas. Der Titel der Veranstaltung heißt Hegemonie oder Harmonie Chinas internationale Ambitionen. Wenn Sie sich für die Reihe interessieren, für diese Dialogreihe Magnet China, können Sie mehr Informationen auch auf der Webseite finden, www.magnet-china.de. Ich danke unseren 3 Panelisten für die spannende Diskussion, Ihnen für die guten Fragen und wie immer laden wir Sie ein, das Gehörte bei einem Glas Wein zu vertiefen. Herzlichen Dank und einen schönen Abend noch.